Hello again. Michael McGovern back with you. Hope you're safe and well and social distancing okay. And for all of our seniors here in our Northwoods nursing homes, retirement communities, we're thinking of you and you're much loved. Wish we could visit in person, but not just yet, apparently. So we're back to the great David Maraniss' When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. To get you caught up as far as where we are in the story right now, Vince is coaching at Army for legendary football coach Red Blake. But Army has just been rocked by a huge academic scandal that has engulfed basically virtually the entire varsity squad. And they're kind of seeing a lot of history and the entire football program possibly slip away. So, where we just last left off, Coach Red Blake said to an assembled group of reporters that he was not going to leave. He was sticking around. He's not retiring. He's not resigning, whatever. And the reporters seem pretty happy about that because he's a popular dude despite what happened with the academic scandal. And he didn't know about it by all accounts. That he was unaware that it was going on. So he was as shaken by it as anyone else. So Red Blake said he would not resign. There was no similar option for his varsity football players. All but 2 out of 45, including Coach Red Blake's son Bob, were packed and gone by the end of the next week, among 83 cadets ultimately separated from West Point in the cheating scandal. Their discharges were by administrative order, neither honorable nor dishonorable. They left without courts martial or due process hearings. They had no lawyers, agents, corporate sponsors, or public relations firms to challenge the authorities or make their cases for them. There was no cable television with its sports channels or sports talk shows on radio to solicit public opinion on behalf of the players. They simply left, carrying conflicted sentiments of guilt, regret, bewilderment, and rage at the system. Blake and his assistants tried in various ways to help them recover and to get into other schools. Murray Warmath was busiest and boldest in that effort. Warmath was an assistant coach. He considered the expelled cadets, quote, the finest group of young men he ever knew, and was outraged by the finality of their punishment. Quote, I thought they were mistreated. I thought it was shoddy and still do, he said nearly 50 years later. Warmath left West Point himself later that year to coach at Mississippi State, then went on to receive national renown at Minnesota. But before he left, he made scores of telephone calls to coaches around the country seeking programs that would accept Blake's boys. Quote, Kenna and Lombardi understood the system better than I did and knew when to keep their mouths shut. I said, quote, bleep on this, it's the S word, and started calling people. Blake knew I was doing it and was happy about it. I had the football players going everywhere. I sent several players to Kansas State, another to Kansas. I hired 2 or 3 of them to work for me down at Mississippi State, got them jobs, end quote. Warmath helped place nearly 20 of the players who were forced to leave. Lombardi worked his strongest contacts with Fordham and the Catholic hierarchy in New York. Within days came a statement of sympathy from Francis Cardinal Spellman, quote, to err is human, to forgive divine, he said, and an offer to accept any of the cadets at Fordham, Manhattan, or Iona. Kenna was on the phone several times with another Catholic benefactor who wanted to remain anonymous, but said he would pay the way for discharged cadets to attend Notre Dame. This unnamed donor was Joseph P. Kennedy, patriarch of the political Kennedys. As Kenna remembered it, quote, Joe Kennedy thought it was terrible what happened to those kids. He had no connection to West Point. He was interested in Notre Dame, the Irish, a big fan. There was no small talk. He just wanted to help, end quote. The offer was made because it was, quote, in the American tradition, Kennedy said, his quote attributed only to the anonymous donor. Quote, a man who makes a mistake should have a reasonable chance to rehabilitate himself. Several cadets responded to Kennedy's bequests and attended Notre Dame. Bob Blake chose to go even farther away, enrolling at Colorado College. One night before leaving West Point, he asked his father, quote, Dad, do you now believe it would have been better to have lied? It was an agonizing question for both Blakes then. Years later, after Bob had received his degree and become successful in the oil business, father and son would not have to swallow hard to answer no. The shadow of scandal thinned over time, and most of Blake's boys eventually regained their footing, many of them in the same army that had tossed them away. Because the cadets were separated by administrative order, not dishonorable discharge, they were not banned from further military service. Some enlisted in ROTC programs at other colleges and returned to the officer corps, and one eventually reached the rank of general. Among those who returned to football in some fashion, backfield stars Al Pollard and Gene Filipski played briefly in the NFL, and lineman Ray Malavasi rose to become a head coach with the Los Angeles Rams. Paul D. Harkins, the rigid colonel who launched the investigation and seemed determined to undo Blake and the football program, wound up a dozen years later as the commanding general of American military forces in Vietnam, preceding the better-known William Westmoreland. Life can turn around on people in unexpected ways. The officer who had disparaged some of Blake's boys at Leone's that night in 1951, calling them a disgrace to the military, was derided himself in Vietnam. From his command post in Saigon, Harkins predicted easy victory and ignored any intelligence to the contrary. He constantly underestimated the troop strength and stamina of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, whom he dismissed as, quote, those raggedy-ass little bastards. False bravado and inflexibility ultimately defined his conduct as an officer. After 2 years running the war, he lost the confidence of the White House and Pentagon, became an object of ridicule among American journalists in Vietnam, and was quietly called home. With every national scandal come shock, surprise, and lamentation on the fall of man. The event is seen by some as substantiation of decline, as though human imperfection were a modern-day phenomenon. Along with diatribes come complaints of public apathy. The righteous express bewilderment that no one seems to care. When the Army cheating scandal broke, one columnist attached it to a list of moral decline that he had been accumulating for decades. George E. Sokolsky, writing in the Christian Science Monitor, took what happened at West Point as proof that the world in 1951 was a wretched hell. Nothing like the good old days. Quote, when the morals of man are considered, we are halted by the astonishing retreat of the 20th century with its excessive divorces, its broken homes, its emphasis on homosexuality, its acceptance of materialistic Marxism in wide areas that were so recently Christian, its avoidance of faith, honor, dignity, sacrifice. We need to know why our people are not outraged at the shameless corruption of our century. Something has gone terribly wrong with us, and we need to know what it is and why it happened. End quotes. Colonel Blake and General MacArthur, who shared some of that larger philosophy, might have taken exception to the manner in which Sokolsky linked the erring ways of Blake's boys to all modern acts of perdition. On the other hand, 9 Republican members of the House Armed Services Committee employed the Red Scare vocabulary of that era to blame the scandal on the Truman administration and Democrats, soft on crime and communism. The cadets, the GOP legislators, argued, quote, were scapegoats, while the real scoundrels, the appeasers, the fixers, and the 5%ers not only have free rein in Washington, but are defended and protected by the White House, end quote. Another debate focused on the narrower question, did the troubles at West Point arise from an overemphasis on football? Senator J. William Fulbright, Democrat of Arkansas and former place kicker for the University of Arkansas Razorbacks, was threatening to hold congressional hearings in Washington and called for the immediate suspension of the Army-Navy game. Quote, it's a disgraceful situation, Fulbright said. Intercollegiate athletics have become so perverted that it's a corrupting influence in the big universities. In an effort to head off congressional action, West Point officials convened another board of officers, this one headed by a professor of electrical engineering, Colonel B. W. Bartlett, to probe the roots of the scandal and its relationship to big-time football. Blake argued that his boys should receive sympathy because of the heavy load they carried in athletics and academics, but the Bartlett board found that the players were pampered from the time they entered West Point to the day they left. They were offered 6-week cram courses known as the Monster Course to help them pass the entrance examinations, provided with tutors throughout the year, and exempted from dozens of minor rules that circumscribed the lives of other cadets. All of this special treatment, the board said, convinced the athletes that the success of the football team, quote, was more important than anything else. The board was careful not to blame the football coaching staff for the cheating, but suggested that Blake bore some responsibility for the academy's overemphasis on football because of the very characteristics that made him a successful coach. His, quote, tremendous driving power, absolute singleness of purpose, and very strong personal convictions, end quote. The summer of 1951 was a season of scandal in college athletics. 14 former basketball players at New York area colleges had pleaded guilty in July to conspiring with gamblers to fix games at Madison Square Garden. In August, while the Army scandal was breaking, a New York grand jury indicted 8 more gamblers and 3 basketball players at Bradley University for fixing games. Those acts were criminal, infinitely more sinister than the academic misdeeds of Blake's boys, yet they appeared less complicated, attributable to need and greed. What happened at West Point, both what it signified and how it should have been resolved, raised complicated points of contention at the time that remain debatable even now. They raised larger questions that addressed the core mythology of football and of the man who went on to become its patron saint, Vince Lombardi. What is the value of competitive team sports? Where is the line drawn between a single-minded desire to excel and a debilitating obsession to win? Are football teams essential to the well-being of institutions and communities? Do athletes deserve special consideration because of this? In a realm where the ultimate measurement is wins versus losses, do ends justify means? The contradictory ideals of unity and independence, conformity and rebellion run deep in the American psyche, and along that divide, football is the sport most clearly aligned with unity and conformity, for better or worse. When asserting that football builds character, coaches invariably speak of teamwork, discipline, perseverance, and loyalty. But even granting football those qualities, are they inherently positive? Or, as the Army Honor Code scandal suggests, can they also lead to group thinking, peer pressure, blind obedience, and an emphasis on team solidarity over individual integrity? Those are the questions raised in 1951, and in one way or another, they would follow Lombardi and define him for the rest of his life. That's the end of Chapter 7. Not going too well at Army at the moment for Vince. As I've mentioned before, this is not an audiobook. This is so I don't do any edits. I don't cut. I talk as best if I can. If I screw up a pronunciation of a word or stumble over something or have to or want to take a drink of water, then that's what we do. It's fine because it's a visit. It's me visiting you. It's not me doing an audiobook. Anyway. On to Chapter 8. No substitute for victory. Nothing could have seemed less relevant to Blake and Lombardi on the afternoon of August 29th than a debate over whether West Point should put less emphasis on football. As the coaches looked out at the ragtag assemblage of athletic irregulars who reported on the first day of fall practice, it appeared that the question had been resolved. A team that would have been a contender, stocked with skilled players at every position, was prematurely gone. Here instead, as the raw material of the 1951 Army team, were the plebes of the year before, talented but untested, along with a few remaining fringe players promoted from the B squad and a legion of eager but overmatched cadet volunteers from the physical education intramural programs. Quote, anyone who would agree to go out and get killed on Saturday afternoons, as one coach confessed. For 7 seasons, from 1944 through 1950, Army had played the best football in the East, earning 2 national championships and 5 Eastern titles while compiling a 57-3-4 record. Now, mere survival was the first concern. As Blake told the curious press corps on the practice field sidelines that first day, quote, we are only thinking of how we can field a team, end quote. Blake was so unfamiliar with his personnel that he was unable to present General MacArthur with his annual preseason analysis of the 3-deep roster. Quote, we have started our football, he wrote in a September 4th letter. Quote, soon I shall write you when I have better knowledge of the squad. At the moment, the defense looks pitifully weak, and our every effort will be to bring it along fast. Villanova is a burly outfit, and our only chance to even contain them is with a good punter and a spirited defense. Villanova was the first opponent on the schedule, and Blake's bleak outlook went beyond his normal pessimism. During the glory years of the late 40s, the schools had met 5 times, and the cumulative score was Army 213, Villanova nothing. Blake devoted the rest of the letter to reliving the scandal. He thanked MacArthur for persuading him not to resign after listening to his sad story, denounced the pious righteousness of Pentagon officials, and urged the general and his wife to take in a few home games. Quote, "Any desire you may wish to eliminate official parties and crowd congestion is easily avoided by coming to our quarters, which is adjacent to Lusk on a dead-end road about 1 block from the stadium," wrote the colonel. But there was no substitute for victory, and MacArthur stayed away. For Lombardi, as he stood near Blake during those first days of fall practice, all seemed uncertain and unexpected. The uncertain abilities of his charges and the unexpected fact that he and the colonel had returned to coach them. During the tense August days when the scandal was unfolding, Vince had prayed daily to St. Anthony and St. Jude to help the coaching staff find its way in what appeared to be a lost cause. He had told friends that he feared Blake would resign. Imagining himself in the colonel's position, he wondered aloud whether he could have withstood that level of pressure as head coach. During his own unhappy spell at Fordham as top assistant to Ed Danowski, after all, he had bailed out after the first round of conflict. Decades later, looking back on his rise, Lombardi came to regard Blake's decision to stay at West Point as a pivotal moment in his career. Quote, "If I ever needed a lesson, and I guess everybody does sooner or later, I got it with Colonel Blake. Red showed me what could be done by perseverance." End quotes. In truth, the lesson flowed both ways, from Blake to Lombardi and back again. In the profession of coaching, there are 2 essential challenges. One is to build a winning team from scratch. The other is to sustain excellence after a club has reached the top. They are distinct tasks, perhaps equally difficult, but usually requiring different intellectual and psychological skills. Even the best coaches are inherently more proficient at one than the other. Lombardi was by nature a builder and a molder, who during his first 2 seasons at West Point learned crucial lessons from the methodical Blake on how to be a sustainer. In the aftermath of the honors scandal, the relationship changed, and Blake became more reliant on his impassioned assistant to burn the white heats back into Army football. The cadets on the roster of the 1951 squad found themselves in a more confusing situation than their coaches, torn as they were by contradictory pressures. Though not implicated in the academic scandal, they were the most visible reminders of it to the rest of the corps, and the players sensed a need to eradicate old stereotypes of Blake's boys. This meant appearing unpretentious and self-effacing rather than apart and self-satisfied. Not much of an act, given the dilution of the squad, but one that nonetheless had a psychological effect. Lowell Sisson, then a third-classman, said later that the notion that football players were special, quote, went straight down the tubes. That first autumn, after the scandal, quote, "We had to depress ourselves to a point where we began to get respected again. We had to keep bringing ourselves down until the Corps decided that maybe these guys aren't so bad after all." End quote. Yet on the practice field, the coaches demanded more of them, especially Lombardi, who was relentless, yapping, roaring, laughing, encouraging, needling, teaching, pushing, in their face until the final drill before showers, the dreaded wind sprints. "Faster, give it your all the time. By God, don't let up now. Faster, keep it up, be winners." Even with this makeshift crew, Lombardi established the goal of perfection. Always, every block, get your shoulder on this side and drive him that way. He brought his backfield players into the projection room on Sundays and force-fed them hours of game film, showing not Blake's depressing favorite, the ignominious 1950 loss to arch-rival Navy, but rather the best and fleetest runners, his standards of the ideal, Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside. Lombardi intended these films to work as positive reinforcement, but inevitably his narrations aroused stronger feelings in the cadets. You can be as good as you want to be, better than you are. All you need is the desire and will to do it, he would say, while on screen the incomparable Glenn Davis glided it downfield against powerful Michigan. Watching Davis, listening to Lombardi, worrying about the distance between the coach's expectations and their own talents, many of the young cadets felt intimidated. Some thought of quitting, but no, they couldn't quit. That would depress them even more. They became angry, determined to show that blankety-blank coach, and Lombardi had them right where he wanted them. As Blake later said of the relationship between Vince and the players in 1951, quote, "He was a driver. Not all the boys liked him, but he brought out the best in each of them." Halfback Sisson broke his nose against Northwestern in the second game of the season and asked Lombardi at practice the next week whether he could wear a single bar across his helmet to protect himself. Lombardi took this request as a sign of meek surrender. "Face guards were for sissies," he thundered. During his louder moments on the practice field, he could seem brutish, maniacal even, yet Lombardi usually knew where the line was that could not be crossed, where he would lose the respect of his players and even of the even-tempered Blake. His exhortations were counterbalanced by occasional hugs, occasional pats on the back, and shared laughter, and also by his brain power, which by football coaching standards was superior. He could be screaming one minute and coolly dissecting an opposition defense the next, seeing things that no one else saw, quickly conceiving a counterattack that required a complex thought and yet seemed so clear and obvious when he laid it out. The scholarly priest of the gridiron, peering out at his students over his glasses, interpreting football's good book. He was, quote, "a very smart guy," said Gerald Lodge, then an offensive guard in his sophomore season. Quote, "he came across as an intellectual." Working with a talent-drained core, the coaches realized that their 1951 team had to rely heavily on intellect and ingenuity. From the Blanchard-Davis era through the seasons of Arnold Galifa and Bob Blake, Army tended to be quicker, deeper, faster, and better organized than the opposition. The other team generally knew what was coming: three backs behind the quarterback in a tight T formation, straight ahead in the belly series or around the end, but could not stop it. Now, Blake and Lombardi improvised more, making use of the positive characteristics that all cadets possessed, even if they were comparatively slow, undersized, and inexperienced, traits shaped by the repetitive physical and mental training of a military environment. First, they were all in top condition, fitter than the other team. And second, they were steeped in the tradition of receiving orders, memorizing them, and carrying them out. As Jerry Lodge said, quote, "everybody was smart enough to remember his plays so we could have relatively complex offensive schemes and change them weekly." That was one of their ploys that year, to have totally different plays every week and the elements of surprise. The technical aspects of the game had always intrigued Lombardi. His notion of a must-read was a satchel full of offensive diagrams, all X's and O's and arrows, and he went out looking for new line splits, variations of the T formation, anything he could find in the vast, uncatalogued library of technical football literature. To him, this was both a vocational and an intellectual pursuit. Johnny Tarzan Drews, his own line mate on the 7 blocks of granite, was then an assistant at Notre Dame, working under Frank Leahy, their former Fordham line coach, who had risen to become an extremely successful head coach with the Irish. When Herb Seidel paid a visit to practice at South Bend, Drews quickly asked him, "What's with Lombardi?" Seidel drew a blank. "What did Drews mean?" "Well," said Drews, "there isn't a week that goes by that there isn't a pound of mail going from Vin to Leahy and back again." Lombardi and Leahy had been exchanging play diagrams, and Drews simply could not recognize that intense level of football curiosity, another manifestation of the drive that separated Lombardi from other assistant coaches. There was still a limit to how far ingenuity and mental and physical conditioning could take the 1951 team. As Blake had anticipated, Army lost the opener to, quote, burly Villanova by 2 touchdowns, beginning a 4-game losing streak that included losses to Dartmouth and Harvard from the usually overmatched Ivy League. The winless slide stopped with a 14-9 victory over Columbia, prompting a congratulatory cable from MacArthur. Quote, "The team was thrilled over your telegram," Blake quickly wrote in return. "Like all cadet football players of the past generation, they share my feeling that you are our number one rooter." But next came a trip down to Yankee Stadium to meet Southern Cal and its dashing star, Frank Gifford, who was posing for Look magazine as an All-America tailback. In his pregame missive to MacArthur, Blake noted that he would employ an, quote, unorthodox defense to try to stop the Trojan attack, but added that, quote, "We are so completely outclassed physically, there is reason to fear that we may not be able to withstand the impact of such a fast and strong squad." Many in the press box observing that game thought Southern Cal could have scored 50 points, but stopped mercifully at 28. Looking back decades later on that trying season, assistant Doug Kenna spoke of, quote, "many long afternoons," but said it could have been worse. The opposing coaches were good to us. They didn't run it up. The Cadets were 2-6 by the time they boarded the train for Philadelphia for the season finale against Navy. It was Blake's worst record ever, and more losses for Lombardi than he had suffered during any season in 2 decades, with the exception of his abortive attempt to resurrect Fordham under the somnolent Danowski. In the internecine world of Service Academy rivalry, this single contest was as meaningful as all other games on the schedule combined. A victory redeemed the most ghastly season, and an upset loss like the one Blake's boys had suffered the year before ruined an otherwise exceptional year. To say that the outcome determined 12 months of bragging rights probably underestimated its significance. Army and Navy were in unending competition elsewhere, at the Pentagon, in the halls of Congress, in the realm of public opinion, fighting for prestige, new weapons, more money, recognition of singular prowess in battle, and all of those struggles were played out symbolically in the game of football. The only national setting where one branch could say indisputably that it was better than the other was on the playing field once each year in Philadelphia. As the Army coaches, their families, the struggling team, and the entire Corps rode the train south to New York and down through New Jersey for the game, one uncomfortable thought prevailed. Could Army sink any lower? Still reeling from the academic scandal, too many of its recent graduates slogging and fighting and dying in the confounding war in Korea, Blake's adversaries around the country taking inordinate pleasure in his troubles, one game could ease some of the pain. If there was a shard of false hope, it was expressed by Lombardi's son, little Vincent, then 9, who, when the delegation reached Philadelphia, busily set about making a fleet of paper airplanes that he flew out the hotel window. "Beat Navy" was scrawled on the wings. For the Navy game, as for all away games, Blake followed his idiosyncratic practice of shepherding his team onto the field hours before kickoff and leading them on a leisurely stroll across the grass in their traveling clothes. He thought of this as a way to sharpen the focus, heighten the sense of anticipation, bring the boys together. Before they left the field for the locker room, Blake gathered the team around him and gave them the first play to run during the game, something for the offensive players to think about as they put on their uniforms. But none of his psychology was of any use this time. Navy scored 2 touchdowns before Army could run an offensive series. In football, as in life, excessive fear and anxiety can dim the brightest mind. Army's young quarterback had been given the first play during the street clothes ritual, and Blake and Lombardi went over it with him again before the first series. With a pat on the back, the signal caller trotted boldly out to the huddle, then made a sudden U-turn and sprinted back to the sidelines, panting. "Coach," he said to the perplexed Blake, "what did you tell me to do? I forgot." So much for the infallible memory of cadets. Yes, Army could fall lower. The final score was 42-7. There was only one blessing in the darkness of defeats. Lombardi and his colleagues were not forced to watch films of the game over and over for the next year. Not even Blake could find a lesson in that loss. And that's where we'll end our time for today, our visit. Again, hope you're well. Here in the Northwoods, by the way, we have so many local seamstresses who are sewing up protective masks, for folks in our nursing homes where you are, folks in the emergency medical field, and just anyone. And we're so grateful to all of those seamstresses who have worked tirelessly to bring in those masks from kits. So if anyone happens to be in the Northwoods, if you're in the area, if you're by Tomahawk, we distribute them at our radio station here at WJJQ in Tomahawk. So if you need masks, you can just look us up online, give us a call. We'll have them ready for you. We'll put them out for you. They'll be available I know hundreds of people have done that, have taken those masks and used them. My family as well, too, certainly. So, again, huge thanks to all the seamstresses who have worked so hard for that. And if you need masks, just contact us at the radio station and we'll take care of you. Great time visiting with you today. Take care and be safe.